today's episode, Andrew and I interviewed Patrick Nachtigall. In 2015, Patrick's book was published entitled In God We Trust. This book talks about the relationship between American culture and biblical Christianity. Election time is just around the corner. We felt like this was a great conversation. Listen in on our conversation with Patrick Nachtigall. Welcome to a World of Good podcast. I'm Nate Tatman.
And I'm Andrew Gale.
And we are two friends
who love Jesus,
care about the church,
and travel the world to share stories of people who do the same.
Our conversations happen in all kinds of places.
Like a coffee shop and an airport terminal.
Or even the back of a crowded taxi.
But no matter where we go, from Argentina to Zimbabwe,
we capture stories of the good God is doing around the world.
And we hope those stories will do you a world of good. Welcome to a World of Good podcast. My name is Andrew Gale, and I'm here with my co-host, Nate Tatman. Nate, you look like you're sitting in a closet somewhere. Where are you, hidden from your family as you're traveling?
Yeah, so I am in my brother-in-law's house in Boise, Idaho, currently.
Oh, so Boise, that's a great city.
Yeah, so we are enjoying a few days of respite here on our road trip, our 2-month road trip, and I'm currently upstairs and tucked away in our room, surrounded by a couple of air mattresses and another bed. I think we have 4 of us jam-packed in this room.
That's awesome.
And so I found my brother-in-law. He has 5 younger kids, so along with our 5 kids, we have a full house. So I'm just trying to stay hidden in a quiet place for these few minutes that we're recording here.
That's awesome. I've only been to Boise one time, but it is a great city. We got to spend time with Pastor Tom Doherty and TJ Samuelu and the church there. It's such a cool city, cool place. Have you done anything fun, anything special since you've been there?
Actually, no.
Did you go to the Blue Field?
No. The last time you were here was the last time I was here. And so I did see the Blue Field, but that was 3 years ago. And we were fairly tired when we got here, so we kind of crashed at their house, and we haven't done anything. We've only left the house a couple of times, and that's to go visit with some people. And so we haven't really seen the city or anything like that. We have, on the way to here, we stopped in Craters of the Moon, which is in Idaho.
Oh, cool.
We stopped, which is very, very cool if you ever get the chance to see that. We've visited Yellowstone for a couple of days. We were in the Badlands for a couple of days, the Black Hills. So we've seen a lot of really, really cool places, and we had a chance to land here for about 4 or 5 days. And so we are just taking the opportunity to kind of hang out and visit with family. I think we're going to go out to a corn maze tonight.
That's very fall.
Which they have those in, yes, the Midwest and here out west as well. Something that a lot of communities do with the harvest. They turn their fields into a big maze. So we're going to do that, and then there's a, I think it's called Tableside Mountain or something like that. I can't remember. We're going to go see that on Friday, and an old penitentiary that was, I think it stopped being used as a penitentiary back in the 70s or so, but it's still open for tourists. So we're going to go check that out.
Interesting. Well, I don't know whether your family will be more or less excited that they are not seeing the Blue Field and instead seeing a jail. But hey, that will be fun nonetheless that you guys are doing it together.
So as a reminder, you can follow us on Twitter at A World of Good Pod. Also on Instagram, you can search for A World of Good Podcast. And we post updates regularly on the Global Strategy Facebook page. And we also have a website where you can learn information about the podcast, and you can sign up to get new episodes in your email inbox. Andrew, what is the URL or the website for them to do that?
Yeah, so it's CHOG Global, CHOG global.org/ A World of Good, all one word.
And as a reminder, what would be really, really helpful for all of you listeners to help us get more listeners and to help this podcast reach more people, first of all, I guess, is to subscribe to this podcast. That way, every new episode just automatically shows up on your favorite listening device. But also write a review for us, as those reviews help to get the podcast I don't know all that goes into it, the algorithms and all of that kind of stuff. But what we do know is that every review helps to get the podcast placed higher on list or rankings or something like that. I'm not sure, but that's what I was told to
We
say.
don't know how it works. We just know it's important.
So please do that. Andrew, are you subscribed? How do you listen to our podcast?
Well, I listen to it on. I mean, I have it on Apple Podcasts, and I listen there. But I've actually really been enjoying Spotify as a place to listen to podcasts recently. So I'm subscribed to the Spotify and think that it's a great way to listen to podcasts.
Yeah, I just recently, I think within the last few months, heard that Spotify has podcasts on them as well. I mean, I knew that we had our podcast on there, but I didn't know that people actually listen to podcasts on there. But my two oldest daughters, that's how they listen to their podcasts. So.
Yeah, it's becoming a thing. I think a lot of podcasts are moving to Spotify or doing Spotify specific content, and yeah, it's a great platform to listen on.
So Andrew, what do you have for us in Coffee Talk?
Now for Coffee Talk.
So, Nate, here's a question that I've been processing that I want to start processing during this segment, during this Coffee Talk segment. And that's the question, really simple question, where does it come from? But I think it's a really important question. So much of what we buy, whether it's stuff that we eat or drink or wear or use, at least for me, I have no idea where it comes from. Mm-hmm. We don't know what went into making it. We don't know what went into getting it to us. I think we're fairly disconnected from the origin of the things that we have. So I think that's something that I'm just finding interesting about coffee. And one of the things that's been fascinating is to start thinking about, where does my coffee come from? So not just like what region is it from and all of that, but also thinking about, who are the people that were a part of farming it, harvesting it and drying it and packaging it and sending it and how it gets to my house. And I think in the mornings, most of us open a package of coffee or make our coffee without really any sense of what it takes to get from one place to the other. And so this was really kind of sparked in my mind from a book that I'm going to throw out there and recommend, and then say, this is the day of book recommendations since we're talking about a book. I'm going to talk about this book quite a bit, I think, over these next few segments with Coffee Talk. And it's called The Taste of Many Mountains. It's written by an economist, a professor named Bruce Wydick. And it's about the production of coffee. He specifically tells it as a narrative of coffee planters and researchers from the United States on fair trade coffee in Guatemala. Really fascinating. But there's all kinds of statistics and information about what goes into the coffee planting process, who's a part of that, how many people are in between that farmer and when it gets to your cup, and what are all the things that happen in that time. Who takes a cut of that in order for it to get to where we are, to us drinking it, for it making it to a coffee shop. And so for me, that's just something that I'm starting to process. The cup that I drink my coffee out of, that I'm holding up here and showing Nate that nobody can see, is a cup that was made for us at Eastside Arts. They have painters and artists that rent out space there, but they have a whole section of pottery. And so a friend of ours made these cups for our entire team. And so, knowing, everything about this, I know where this cup came from. I know whose hands created it. And I know that when I drink my coffee from it, that who I have to thank for that. And so now I want to know about the coffee that's in that cup and where that comes from. So I just want to start that's going to be a conversation that we're going to have in this Coffee Talk segment in the next few weeks. But I'd encourage you to check out the book, The Taste of Many Mountains by Bruce Wydick, and yeah, start to process even looking at your packaging and wondering where could it possibly have come from.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Have you ever had the chance to visit a coffee farm?
Yes. So not many, but when I've been in Costa Rica, I've been able to visit a coffee farm and a place where they both, it's a co-op where they have different folks that farm in the area that bring coffee. They also grow some of their own there, but then they dry it, they roast it even and send it on. But I love getting coffee there. And I love walking through and seeing the work that gets done. It's a really neat place. I've actually been there twice. And after going there the first time, when I went down the second time, I said, I have to go back to this coffee farm. So please make sure that is a part of our experience. So Not to a lot of them, but I have been to a few, and it's fascinating.
It is, and I would highly recommend it to anybody, if given the chance to pay whatever you need to pay to go on a coffee farm tour, because it does help you, I think, not just appreciate, but to value coffee even more because of the amount of work that it did take to get from that coffee tree into your home and into your mug. The amount of hands it passed through, the equipment, the machines, the work, and it just gives you, a more appreciation of how big this industry is. But that does spill over into other things as well. And just on this trip that we are on right now, driving through the different states, obviously a rich history of Native Americans and as well as pioneers, and just thinking through how those people would have reacted seeing some of this land for the first time. And to think, driving through Yellowstone, some of these pioneers or the Native Americans, they had to, anything and everything that they consumed had to come from their hands, had to be grown, had to be made. And so we don't necessarily have a lot of that, hardly any of that in our modern day lives today, unless we're very intentional about it.
And I also think, I think that this interview we're doing today is so apropos for this conversation as well, because I think as Christians, we tend to have a pretty short view of our faith and what it looks like on a global scale. And so I think that, this conversation with Patrick is so timely. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to bring up this. I think it's helpful for us to understand the origins of where our Christian faith has come from in its history and in our country, and how that brings us to where we are today and what that means for us as we think about ourselves as being a Christian nation. And so I wanted to start this conversation of where did it come from, because I think it connects in with our conversation with Patrick later on in the program.
Yeah, interesting.
But Nate, as we move on, what is in the news?
So our in the news topic for today comes from an AP Associated Press news article that was written on October 1st, and the headline reads, "Faith Groups Decry Trump's Plans for Record Low Refugee Cap." And this article was written by Julie Watson and Matthew Lee, and it actually goes back something that we referenced in the first episode of this season. And that has to do with the ceilings, the refugee ceiling in terms of, or the refugee cap, I guess, that we have here in the United States. And let me just read kind of the opening paragraph, or I think the second paragraph. The article reads, "In a notice sent to Congress late Wednesday, just 34 minutes before a statutory deadline to do so, the government unveiled its proposal to allow 15,000 refugees into the country in the fiscal year that started Thursday. The number is 3,000 fewer than the historically low ceiling of 18,000 that Trump set for the fiscal year that ended Wednesday." And so I thought, again, this was an important topic to bring up, as this was in the news a few months since the last time we talked about this. But it's just disheartening to see this number continue to be on the decrease in this administration. And so since President Trump has taken office, he has reduced the number to 45,000 in his first year, 30,000 refugees allowed into the country in his second year, and then 18,000 this past year. And by comparison, in the last term, so the last 4 years of President Obama's presidency, they averaged 110,000 refugees coming into the U.S. And so historically, since the Refugee Act was established in 1980, the United States has averaged a ceiling of 95,000 refugees. And I think it's important for us to remember or to note the difference between a refugee and an immigrant. A refugee, who we are talking about in this article, by definition is someone who is forced to leave their home country because of war, persecution, or natural disaster. And I think we talked about that a little bit in the first episode. An immigrant, by contrast, is someone who chooses to leave their home country to live in another country. And so, just some of the consequences that are happening. There are many resettlement offices who are having to close because of the drop in federal funding, because the cap is obviously becoming decreased. And meanwhile, there's an estimated 80 million refugees worldwide due to war, who have been displaced due to war, famine, and persecution. So 80 million worldwide refugees, and the U.S. is only going to allow 15,000 coming into this next year. What can we do about this? Obviously, pray as a ministry, as a local ministry in your church, talking about what you can do to maybe reach out to missionaries or organizations that are working with refugees or countries where refugees are coming from, contacting your local government, asking them what it is that you can do. But I just feel like, this is the second time we've kind of talked about this, but I feel like it's such an important topic that we need to make sure as that we are following in terms of what's happening in the news surrounding refugees.
Yeah, and I just think, man, what a missed opportunity for the church to offer hospitality and welcome to people in really difficult situations. There's a number of Christians that need to be resettled around the world because they're in hostile places. But whether Christian or not, a lot of the agencies in the United States that are doing the resettling are, agencies like Catholic Charities and these Christian-based not-for-profits who have an opportunity to really show the love of Jesus to those that are coming from really tragic situations, to offer hospitality and care and welcome. And I think the distinction's really helpful, Nate. Oftentimes we confuse refugees and immigrants, and there is overlap in the sense that refugees are immigrants, but all immigrants are not refugees. And so in this sense, these are people who are fleeing. These are people who have gone through, 18 months to 3 years of interviews before they hit the ground here in the United States or elsewhere. There's a lot of other countries around the world that also accept refugees.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate you bringing that to our attention. I hope people will do more research on that, and ask questions, because we're more than willing to be challenged or, to hear other perspectives. But man, I have a hard time looking at that and not seeing a huge missed opportunity for the church. We don't even have to go find them. They're coming to us, and we have an opportunity to love on them. And I don't want to miss that.
Yep. Absolutely. Missed opportunity is a great description of what's happening here, not just, again, as Christians, but I also believe as a country as well. We have a missed opportunity to impact and influence the world in a positive way, and we're not taking advantage of that.
Well, today we have an awesome interview that actually connects. One of Patrick's ideas that he presents at the very end is how immigrant communities in the United States, not specifically refugees, but immigrants, will be a great force for the church moving forward because they bring a vibrancy in their faith that has potentially kind of stagnated in our country. So it's interesting how that actually connects. But today we get to hear from Patrick Nachtigall, who wrote a book called In God We Trust, and he's going to share just about the book, what it's about. And I think it's a really timely conversation as we kind of talk about who are we as a country, where are we going, and what might God be calling us to.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the thing that I'm asking our listeners to think about is, what is my obligation or commitment as a Christian versus as a citizen of the United States, for those of you who are listening to this and are citizens of the U.S.? And I think there's a difference there that we need to keep in mind and that we need to filter through.
So here's our interview with Patrick Nachtigall. Well, I'm so excited that I get to have this conversation today with Patrick Nachtigall, who's joining us, Nate and I, to talk about your book, Patrick, In God We Trust, which came out 5 years ago in 2015, but you wrote it, you were saying, in 2014. So this came out a couple years before the previous election. And so I read it a few years ago and found it really helpful for me in terms of giving some language and framing some of what I had experienced and seen and felt, but didn't have words for, or didn't know how to kind of describe what I thought I was seeing. And this book gave some great language for that and gave me some handles in order to kind of understand what I might have been seeing in American evangelical Christianity. And so as we entered into this election season again this year, I pulled the book back out just as another touch point to remind myself the kind of baggage that I bring into these kinds of seasons this time. And I brought it out in order for our staff at Global Strategy. We've been reading through it together. And I just thought it'd be fun. I mean, because how better does it get to have an author actually come talk about what you've written, just to have you on the podcast to just talk about the book, the content, and some thoughts in terms of what this means for us as we engage in global ministry. So that's going to be our goal today, is just to process some of that together. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So I want to jump right in. In this book, you lay out in part 1 that there are 3 American gods, and you list them as being religious freedom, individualism, and materialism. Can you give us just a quick overview of those 3 concepts? Because I think those 3 ideas are what lead the entire rest of the conversation forward. And so having just kind of a overview of some of that might be helpful.
Sure. Well, I think the United States is a really unusual country. Its religious history is just nothing like anybody else's. And so it's formed a very kind of special way of expressing the religious faith in this country, whatever it is. The predominant faith has been Christianity. And the way that this formed was really that we had a open country with no history that was settled and invented its own history. Now, of course, we had Native Americans who were wiped out by the settlers mostly, but the people that settled the United States brought with them a lot of different religious ideas, and they brought with them the freedom to reinvent what church could be, because prior to the United States, you had people born into tribes or kingdoms or lands where the religion was given to you. You grew up in a certain faith. And it was part of your identity as well, your ethnic identity. And so the idea that you could just be a separate religious person, not linked to a pope, or not linked to some very large body, but just kind of create the religion yourself. It's a very, very new idea. And so we kind of see the birth of this type of Christianity and religious freedom in the United States, where you get to choose if you want to be a Buddhist, you get to choose if you want to be a Muslim. And if your child is a Christian in elementary school or comes from a Christian family, nobody in America expects that they'll not have the freedom to change their mind in the future. And so that kind of got reached a hyper level in the United States when you had the birth of all these different sects and denominations. So that's a bit of the religious freedom angle. As far as materialism, the United States is an unusually wealthy country. It's incredibly wealthy compared to the rest of the world. Just to give you an illustration, even now, of how wealthy the United States is, the endowment of Stanford University, just of Stanford University, is larger than the entire economy of Uganda per year.
Wow.
So
Wow.
that, this country has an abundance of wealth, everything from its geography, its crops, its companies, what people own, the property they own. And so that has led to a religion that gets very filled with a belief that materialism is good. And religion prior to that had often been about negating material things and not having material things. Whereas suddenly the floodgates were kind of open in America, where, to get rich was a good thing and a spiritual thing. And evangelicals really have made that a very big thing, especially with the prosperity gospel. And I know in the book, I actually highlight not only the prosperity gospel, but the Mormon church as an example of one lone leader who declared himself a prophet, not connected to anyone else, starts a bunch of churches, and they have absolutely no shame about getting wealthy. And they become, one of the biggest landholders and wealthiest organizations in the United States. So another unusual move. And so then the third thing that I mentioned is radical individualism. And that one, once again, in the history of the world, societies had a belief that community was important, that you wouldn't survive the difficulties of the world, the medieval world, the ancient world without other people. And when these settlers arrived in this very empty land, and they were genuinely on their own and could literally stake a claim in land, and it was theirs, didn't belong to any king, it didn't belong to any landlord. There was a spirit of individualism that was completely brand new in the history of the world. And I call it radical individualism, because it's the belief, it's truly the belief that you don't need anybody. And so that, has affected the mentality of America and even American Christianity, in the sense that a lot of us believe we have a very private individual faith. It's about my relationship with God or with Jesus. We don't think it has to go through a church or a denomination or through Rome or through our ethnicity. It's solely yours. So these are just a kind of a little example of some of the issues that I explore in those three areas.
And they all intertwine together in a really unique way. I mean, even like your comment about religious freedom being something new with the Enlightenment, and that the Enlightenment's also what gave us the ability to talk about the individual outside of the community. Like, so much of that is about also the way that we understood ourselves and how we related to society and culture. And once we had that ability to pull out our religious life as something separate, which the Enlightenment gave us, we were able to talk about this in a very different way, which totally shifts, hundreds and hundreds of years prior. So when we end up overlaying my religious beliefs on, I believe like somebody did 300 years ago, well, that's really not even possible to express, because their whole construct of what a person is different than where we are today. And that was really helpful in your chapter on religious freedom, really helping to us to understand, me to understand what the religious life was like for the Puritans that came over, as well as what religious life was like for the time of the founding fathers. You have a statistic that 17% of the population attended church during just before and after 1776. That's not in the imaginary that I have of what that world was like.
Right. And I think, you hit the key there, Andrew, is talking about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment basically ushered in the era of science and rational thinking and kind of putting religion to the side. Yeah. And that is very much what the founding fathers believed. They were not trying to establish a Christian country. Quite the opposite. They were all about breaking away from the empires, breaking away from religious wars, breaking away from the King of England, and letting people find their own individual selves. Yeah. And, I had a professor once point out what a strange statement it is: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He pointed out that back in the 1700s, the idea of pursuing happiness was just kind of ridiculous. An individual doesn't do that. You live in a community, and the idea that life could be happy instead of full of sorrow and war and empires and evil landlords was just a really foreign idea.
Yeah, I'm very intrigued about this whole idea of radical individualism, because I think it's just so innately part of who we are as Americans. Again, we think about ourselves first, decisions that we make, whether it's marriage, career, job, schools, and I don't know if we really fully understand how it creeps in or becomes part of our belief in God and Christianity and that sort of thing. Maybe just you kind of did a little bit, but pick whatever continent or country you want to, but maybe just talk about the opposite of individualism in a different cultural context for our listeners.
Well, I spent 11 years living in Asia and in two different countries and traveling all throughout the continent. And, in most of East Asia, your society comes before you. Your obligation to your family comes ahead of your individual obligation. And so something like not littering or staying quiet on the subways of Tokyo are things that people do because it's not about you. A great example that I really like of that mentality of community matters all the time, everywhere. It's not about the individual, is during the World Cup that occurred in Russia, the last World Cup. The whole world was just, very moved by the fact that the Japanese soccer team, after they got knocked out of the World Cup, cleaned up the lockers in the stadium, and because that's what you do, you clean what you've used.
Yeah.
Another story that I often like is the story of a Westerner bringing some toys to some children in Uganda, and it was a toy, and the kids became very sad and said, "Well, why are you sad?" "Well, we'll only be happy if everyone has a toy." And so that kind of thinking is very ingrained into many cultures of the world. And you even see that in America with immigrant communities who, for instance, are working very hard to send money back to their families in the Philippines or Mexico or Nigeria. They're working as janitors and putting in 60 hours a week. And half of that money, or I know in Hong Kong, sometimes 75, 80% of the money that Filipino or Indonesian maids made went back to their families in their country, where, we're kind of the opposite. It's all about, you taking care of yourself and making as much money as you can. And so this is really very relevant in a pandemic, because a pandemic is something where you absolutely have to have people moving in a uniform fashion, believing the same things, and viewing the safety of their neighbor as just equal or greater than yours. And so it's no coincidence that we're seeing the best responses to COVID-19 in Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, Vietnam. That's no coincidence.
Absolutely. And I think when we look at this, it can't be understated. The word radical in front of individualism is so good, because when you look at on a cultural spectrum, like the United States is the most individualistic culture, in the world. And not only that, I had a professor one time talk about the difference between competitive and cooperative individualism, and that, there are other countries that are individualistic, but they're cooperative in the way that they express that individualism. But in the United States, we're not even cooperative. Like, we're competitive about our individualism. Yeah. We have to be the best, and we have to be the best because you have to be the worst. Like, those are our options, and just very different than the rest of the world.
And the beauty is it produces things like, putting man on the moon with the computer power that we have in a modern day cell phone, or the creation of Silicon Valley, or the incredible missionary movement that came out of the United States. So, I mean, it has a positive side, but it also has a very dark side. And especially in moments of crisis and challenge, society that doesn't have that kind of glue of putting others first is going to struggle.
It was one of the comments I made recently to my family. We were talking about the pandemic, COVID-19, and I just made the comment that, what helped, people in Kansas and in the Midwest get through the pioneer age, get through the Dust Bowl, was their rugged individualism. That helps you get through those times. That's going to be very difficult and unhelpful in moments when you all have to come together. And so, you're exactly right. In certain areas, certain times, that individualism is a great asset, but it can also be an incredible detriment if we're not aware of how that affects the way we interact with other people.
Yeah, as I say in the book, I really think that the period between 1800 and 1899 is really when the American heart and spirit and religion was formed. And it was a time of people moving past the Appalachians and bravely and individualistically settling the land, not always in super great ways, of course, because we know that a lot of people suffered over that. But I mean, it was an incredible mass movement of individualism, a word that really was coined by de Tocqueville when he came to the U.S. as a Frenchman. It's a very, very significant characteristic that formed the heart of America's personality.
You mentioned in the book, what I kind of see as your thesis is the idea that U.S. evangelical Christianity wavers between a sense of triumphalism and apocalyptic self-condemnation, which I think it's a great phrase. But walk me through that. What does that mean? For someone who hasn't read the book, what do you mean by, American Christianity, evangelical Christianity wavers between a sense of triumphalism and apocalyptic self-condemnation?
Well, a lot of countries, have a feeling about themselves either that they're very great and special, or they have a feeling that they're absolute losers and always will be. And I mean, to give you an example, Japan and China are two countries and cultures where the national identity is very much that we are the middle of the earth. That's actually what the word China, 中国, means, is middle kingdom. Japanese very much view themselves as a divine race of people. Then you have countries like, say, Bulgaria and Russia, who have national pride, but they also have a sense of things have always been bad and they're going to be even worse tomorrow. And that's just deeply ingrained in their mentality. It's pretty unusual for a country to be like the United States, which alternates between we're the greatest country in the world, we're number one, and then in the next sentence, we're being punished because we're so sinful. The hurricane hit us because it was God's way of punishing us. Right now, you're hearing a lot of people say, America's falling apart. America's not going to survive this. And it's just this constant extreme dualism, which comes from evangelical Christianity. It comes from this belief that we can achieve anything with God's help. And then this love of apocalypticism, which is the world is ending soon, and we better get all this stuff done quickly, including being missionaries to every country in the world, because it's all going to end real quick. And so this is very much a product of our religious identity that filters out into our national identity, that we're either rocking the whole world and we're number one, or we're the worst country and the worst things are happening to us because we're bad and evil.
Well, and even to a certain extent, I'm hearing more and more language that talks about we are living in the last days because of, the weather's getting worse, more hurricanes, the pandemic, all of this uprising. And so it's like, we are, Christ is coming back anytime, any day. But at the same time, it goes back to this individualistic perspective of Christianity where it's all about me and my generation.
Yeah. And my generation.
Never mind that these things have been happening and going on for thousands of years. Yeah. But again, and you talk about this in your book, we're very short-sighted in our history, American history, world history, and our Christian history as well, church history. And so, we think that we are living in these last days because of all these things happening, when the fact is they've been happening for ages.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything from the collapse of Rome to a giant earthquake in Lisbon in the, I think, 1400s, to the fall of the French monarchy. Pretty much every moment in history has been viewed by religious people as the end of the world. And that even extends to Buddhist faiths, Islam. The apocalyptic tradition is in Hinduism. Wow. It's not just a evangelical thing or a Christian thing. It's very much, the Mayans, of course, thought the world was going to end and had their calendar. So it's just something that each generation, like you said, Nathan, thinks that they're the most special ones and things have never been worse. But in fact, really, the world has never been safer and healthier than it is today, and with less war than any moment in history.
Less war, and we may be getting a little off track here, but we also have less people living in poverty, correct? Or below the poverty line?
Yeah, we have less people in poverty than ever in history by a long shot. And we have more religious freedom around the world than we ever have had. So things are not very revelation kind of, but it's fun to pretend, apparently.
It is. You talk about that term triumphalism, that the U.S. American Christianity wavers between triumphalism and apocalyptic self-condemnation. So triumphalism is this idea that we are qualitatively better than others. And so thus, we should, and oftentimes that triumphalistic spirit causes us to say, well, we need to share our greatness with others. So turning just a little bit, taking some of the concepts in this book that you've just highlighted, which to me, we've done the broad sweep of some of the big themes. I want to take this now to a global reality and a global connection. So how would you say the spirit of triumphalism, how has it been a part of the American Christian work globally? What has that looked like?
Much like the early missionary emphasis from Great Britain, when American missionaries went out, it was often very much to Americanize people and to create a Christianity that had all of the American values. And it wasn't just kind of saying to, tribal people in Africa, you have to dress the way we do on Sundays, or it's sinful because your skirt is made out of grass is sinful or something. It didn't just extend that, but it was even how we do missions. For instance, trying to quantify the market that we're trying to reach every nation with a target date, identifying some of them as the 1040 window, and trying to reach every people group. All of this is kind of a language of, we're going to triumph over this, not that this is kind of a work in progress or that it's fluid, but no, this is a project that we are embarking on, and we are going to conquer it. So we have this very kind of quantifiable, business-like way of building churches or sending missionaries or whatever it is that you're trying to do. So it's a very kind of capitalist, let's set up our McDonald's franchises around the world and standardize them. So it's kind of like the McDonaldization of Christianity coming out of America.
Which I think, for me, I think about triumphalism. I'm certainly not pro-triumphalism, if you can be pro or con triumphalism, but that triumphalistic spirit, just like that individualism, the positive of it is that there's a desire to bring whatever we've experienced as good to somebody else. The negative is doing that in a way that that wipes out or erases somebody's culture or their understanding or belief that what they have is not okay and what I have is better.
Yeah.
And I think that's that challenge, is that balance between those two.
Right. I think American missionary movement, and especially American evangelicalism, is very much like Silicon Valley. It's all about risks and experimentation and doing the crazy thing, inventing something new to get it to work. And that's a beautiful thing, and it's been incredibly effective. But the downside can be expecting every other culture to then embrace that value and be that way. And some of these cultures, for instance, have that tradition of, say, cleaning up the locker room after a soccer game because that's the right thing to do. And we don't want to steal that from them.
Yes.
We don't want to rob an African culture of some of the traditions they have that are not American and not capitalist, that are, maybe very special. Like, we're not happy until everyone has a toy, so nobody's going to play until it's equal. That's a good thing. Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that I wrestle with is, how do we allow other countries, other ethnic groups to express their Christian faith in a way that's different than our specific form of American Christianity? How do we engage in a way that allows them to find, that shows them Jesus without expecting to show them American Jesus, that balance of that. And I don't know how to do that well. I think it's a really complicated task to do that.
I think a lot of it is about letting go of power. I mean, one of the key moments, for Christianity was when the Bible was translated into people's local individual languages. And that's kind of the moment where each culture got to read the text for themselves and interpret it through their framework. And the book was not American, or it was not from, the Pope in Rome, but it was for the people of whatever country in Africa or whatever country in Asia. And that's really about releasing power and releasing control. And so I think that the same thing goes true for churches that expand overseas or missionaries. There has to be at some level a sense of, this is not going to look exactly like what is familiar for me. And a lot of countries struggle with that. A lot of American missionaries have struggled with that. But I mean, a really good example is that a lot of Korean missionaries struggle with that. They really, really expect a Korean church in Zambia to operate exactly like it would in Seoul, and it's never going to happen. So it can be a source of tension, and it's always a challenge to kind of let go of that power.
Yeah, you've said in one of your other books that, and I think it's connecting back to what Lamin Sanneh has said, that the Bible itself is a multicultural book. It's made up of multiple languages. It's written over a long stretch of time with different ethnic groups that spoke into it, and so it itself is already a cross-cultural document, different than other religious traditions where, the true reading of the Quran is done in Arabic. Like there is no reading outside of
Right.
that. But how the Bible, even from the outset, was a cross-cultural text, and so then gives space for other cultures to speak and learn and engage with it.
Right. And I mean, the Bible is so clear on that point that by Genesis 12, you're only 12 chapters into the book, God's already saying, by the way, this is not for one nation of people. This is going to be for everyone,
Yeah.
which kind of really undercuts the idea of, America being the chosen country by God, or Israel, for that matter of fact.
Or anybody.
Yeah. I mean, by Genesis 12, he's saying, no, this is going to be a blessing for everyone. And that's how it's got to be. And then the rest of the Bible, you see either that happening globally, or you see the church or the religious people trying to fight it and stifle it.
Yeah.
So that's the constant tension that, at least the Bible is honest about showing us that tension, which still exists today.
So, going to switch gears a little bit with where our conversation has been going. And there's this little thing coming up here next month called the election here in the United States. And, I'm fairly fatigued of the political conversations that have been taking place. Yeah. But I think it's so important to take a look at and for us to understand how our politics here in America, how they impact the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is watching us. They are watching what happens here in the U.S. and this election season. But how have you experienced American politics and political life affecting your work globally? You've lived abroad now for 20 plus years. So I'm sure you've got some stories or experiences that you want to share in terms of how our political system here in the U.S. and outcomes have affected your work globally.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty interesting time. I think, the tension that's playing out right now in the United States is being copied in other countries. And so, for instance, you see let's call them the religious right in Costa Rica trying to assert itself and put in a Christian president. And other countries around the world having some very religious figure like Modi in India. Let's put in a Hindu president. This attempt to have a national religion, it's really spreading. And, a lot of that is a backlash against globalization, which is that, too many immigrants came in. We used to be a nation that was clearly Hindu or Muslim or Christian, and now it's getting really diluted by secularism or other religions. And so what we need to do is, move back toward this one religion that was always at the center of our society. So a lot of evangelical churches, and I think one of the really good examples is the church in Brazil, getting caught up in the Bolsonaro thing. And, you have a very out of the box kind of authoritarian leader there, and who's made some questionable comments about race and other issues. And you have a religious right, let's call them, that very much follows them. And then that creates a fission in the church between those who join that kind of view of leadership and the direction of the country and others that don't. So I think we're going to see more and more communities around the world that are religious split apart. And you're seeing it already. You have a clear percentage of American Christians that are not on board with the Republican platform, and you have a clear percentage that are. It's the same thing in India with Hinduism. You're seeing more and more Hindus who are very committed Hindus who are saying, I'm not in line with Hindu nationalism, even though I'm a Hindu. And so it's going to be a really, really rough period of time for countries as far as religious identity is concerned.
Have you seen, is this something where America has kind of led this movement? Because you said you've kind of seen this happening now on a global scale. Has America led this, or is America part of this kind of global movement towards this in this direction?
Well, that's why I wrote the book, because the U.S. is a place that is so wealthy, because the Christian community in the United States has an annual economy of about oh gosh, I think it's $8 billion
Wow.
that Christians spend. Because we have so many satellites, we have so many religious networks, because we produce so many Christian books, Christian music artists, et cetera, et cetera. Because let's call it our Christian industry is so massive and wealthy, we are the country that exports the evangelical brand around the world. And so a lot of what you see in other countries is very much them taking up the identity of American Christianity, evangelical Christianity. They're basically getting their cues about what political thing is important, what issue is important, and that gets transported. So say an issue like abortion. Maybe abortion isn't an issue in a certain country, but because it is with Christians in America, it becomes a hot button issue in another country by evangelicals in that country, because they've adopted that issue. And a lot of Americans would be surprised that abortion was not even an issue for evangelicals. The controversy about abortion did not become a part of evangelical debating and thought until 1979. It originally started with the Roman Catholic Church in 71. So it was not even a political hot button issue or on the radar at all. And only recently did it become part of the evangelical American community's hot button issue. And then that's exported around the world. So that's kind of an example of how that happens.
But I think that's so important to realize, because I think it's easy to become insulated in our thinking that, the decisions that are being made in the United States right now are only going to affect Americans, and the decisions that are made are only going to affect, the election cycle is only, we have to figure that out and deal with that. I don't know that we're as aware of the global ramifications of the things that we say, or the things that we do, or the things that we choose to be for or against, and how that gets translated cross-culturally around the world.
Yeah, and I don't mean this as a political comment at all, but when Trump was elected, I predicted on Twitter actually that we would see a bunch of kind of Trump-like clones in other countries, because whatever the U.S. does, people copy. Whether it's hip hop and rap, which now Muslims produce, and there's rap artists in Japan and Australia, and there's rap in India, there's rap in Tunisia. Whatever we do in the U.S. ends up getting copied, and so it's the rise of some of these other leaders like Bolsonaro and Duterte and others. That's not an accident. Now, if you like Trump in that style, then it's good for you, because it's spreading to that style is spreading to other countries, and there are a lot of Filipino Christians who like that style of leadership. But if you're someone who doesn't like it, well, then you don't like that it's spreading. But the point is just the copy factor.
Yeah.
And no region hates copying the United States more than Europe, and no country hates copying the United States more than France. But France is the biggest consumers of McDonald's.
Interesting.
So.
There's a fun fact for you.
Yeah. So, I mean, and of course, France has a huge rap industry, for instance,
Wow.
huge rap music industry. So it's like an example of how we really are good at exporting everything.
Those are some of the things that, happen without us trying. They're more of the incidental things that happen that we're not attempting to change. But what are some of the policy changes? And I just I'm trying to think of how to ask this. As a missionary who lives globally, who has to work outside the United States, how do policy changes in the United States affect the work that you're doing, either making it easier or more difficult to do what it is you feel like you're called to do? Does that make sense? Does my question make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it has an incredible amount of relevance to us. So, for instance, even now with COVID-19, because the United States is in the top 5 of countries not handling COVID well and has the most people that have died from it, it pretty much means that all the countries here in Europe are like, we're not accepting you to come into our country. And if you do, you have to quarantine for 14 days, which is very difficult. If someone from America came to my house today, my child wouldn't be able to go to school. So that's kind of just one example. But another issue is, for instance, like I was mentioning, if for instance our system of government gets copied and there's more, say, a rise of authoritarianism, you might see that in a place like Hungary, which then has an impact on the freedom of Christians or missionaries that live in a country like that.
Yep.
Suddenly they may be more monitored,
Yep.
or not allowed to come in and out, or even maybe allowed to exist. During the Gulf War, and then again, especially with the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, I travel a lot through the Middle East, and there was a period of time there where the assumption was just that all Americans hate Muslims. And so when you show your American passport, there would be a suspicion there. And it's like, that's not who I am. That's the policy of maybe my country, or we're involved in some kind of foreign policy issue, but that's not me. But that can limit, for instance, whether you get permission to live in that country.
Yeah.
Suddenly the country you were working in, maybe doing good work, helping the poor, helping orphans, maybe fighting sex trafficking, all of a sudden you're kicked out because of what your country has done.
I don't think I ever realized how problematic that was until you start traveling and start experiencing some of those challenges, or listening to some of our missionaries as they talk about visa issues, or attempts to get together as a team with national leaders, and the inability to do that because of regulations that are set, policies that are made, and not realizing how much that just interplays with that we are so much of a global community. We're a global community that's trying to figure out how to move forward, and every decision that gets made in any other country affects so many of the other countries. And the United States is one of the countries that the policies that are made affect so many people serving around the world.
Yeah, I mean, a good example is the trade war with China and the increasing tensions between the U.S. and China. Now we've seen in the last year that a lot of Christian workers in China have had the government show up at their door and say, you have to get out of the country immediately, not in an hour, not tomorrow on the next plane, but immediately leave everything in your house and get out now. And that's something that wasn't happening 3 years ago or 5 years ago or 8 years ago, and certainly not when I lived there, when there was just this incredible exchange of Chinese people welcoming Americans everywhere.
So let's play this out a little bit, Patrick, because I know you like to play the long game. I know you like to plan things out and make predictions and things like that.
The whole third part of this book is predictions for the future. I mean, I was like, this is so Patrick Nachtigall. I love it.
Yeah.
So, and I can't,
Very
I've
true.
read it,
Very
but I can't remember the predictions. Maybe you've already written about this, but play this out for us in terms of, because evangelical Christians in the United States, they have looked to the political system to help Christianize America. To help, those things that we care about, the church, Christianity, freedom of religion, abortion rights, different things like that, to help us on a political, at a political level and with our governments, things like that. What's the danger in that? What's the worst thing that can happen if the evangelical church continues to push and to see the Republican or Democratic Party as the answer to their questions as it pertains to their values and beliefs in God, in Jesus Christ?
Yeah, well, very predictably, what happens is people begin to leave the religion and leave the church. Yeah. And it weakens the religion. The more you politicize it, the more you make the country act like it belongs to a particular religion, the more you see people want to leave. It doesn't matter whether it's evangelical Christianity or if it's Shia Islam in Iran, or if it's ISIS in the Iraq area, or if it's Hinduism in India. When religious people decide they want to go political and go hardcore political, they end up starting to kind of finish off their their religion for a time being. And so that's why it's no accident that many millennials and Generation Z people are not interested in evangelical Christianity. They don't want to have anything to do with it. We're going to see more and more of that. And that's been my experience talking to people of that generation, which I do a lot. And so it's self-defeating because people don't want to have religion mandated to them, especially in Western societies. They don't want the government telling them they must be a particular religion. And so the more the government does that, the more people will rebel against it. And the second big problem that happens is that as a religion like evangelical Christianity becomes political, what happens is the people in that country start associating every political failure with that religion. This happened in Pakistan with Islam. It's not just, once again, it's not just an evangelical problem, but, every government is going to fail, and every government's going to do really stupid things that the people hate. And if that government has the brand of evangelical Christianity on it, people will hate it. And then that's what is happening. That process has been well underway since the mid 90s, especially, but certainly all through the 2000s. And now we're reaching a real climax in that area, where you're just going to see, weaker and weaker religious bodies, and probably we're hitting peak religious political influence right now. And it'll really start to drop quickly.
It's interesting to me that, and I'm just making an observation, I'm not aligning myself with any political party or anything like that, but it is interesting to me that, based upon what you just described to us, that the more that we seek out the government to answer our questions or to solve our issues, such as, the freedom to pray in schools, or to post the 10 commandments. We're looking to the government to find those answers. And the more that we push for that, really what you're saying, that's to our own detriment as Christians here in the U.S., as evangelical Christians.
Absolutely. I mean, it's far more inspiring when it's organic, when people are exposed to maybe someone helping the homeless, or someone fighting sex trafficking, someone getting involved in the real world and real people's lives, as opposed to having it mandated by the government. It goes back to that, the dynamism in American Christianity is often that it was entrepreneurial. It was not a state religion. It was not centered in Rome. There was no Rome in the United States that became the religious capital. And that was the entrepreneurial magic, that unleashed Christian growth. And so ironically, what we're trying to do now is create a Rome and create a state religion, everything that Europe that the founding fathers tried to get away from, and which wrecked Europe and made it highly secular.
Going back to a different topic, but I still connected to this. One of the three gods that you talked about that American Christianity is so connected to. You talked about religious freedom, individualism. The third was materialism. I wonder if you can talk about, does global ministry ever fall into the materialism trap? As Americans, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think a big area where that has happened is in churches wanting to do very big projects, thinking that the best thing they can do is build a large building, a large church. When, maybe the best thing to do is to invest in people, pastors, leaders. And those big buildings can often be more about the church in America wanting a big win and something big to show and something that looks grandiose than the harder work of maybe educating someone that's going to, have 20, 30, 40 years of ministry life, but they're not going to be able to show you the win right away. So a lot of our projects have tended to be that way, more focused on kind of grandiosity and what would look like a big win. I think that there's often like going into a place with too much money You can go into a village and that's very poor, and you've seen churches dump a ton of money on a village. They adopt a village, and what they end up doing is creating a society that becomes very materialistic, and the villagers no longer work together, and everyone's fighting for that one toy, to go back to the illustration we used about Africa. And there's been a lot of like well-meaning tragedies that have happened because Americans often lead with money.
Yeah.
And that's something that, hopefully we get more away from. I mean, there are times when it's needed. I mean, obviously when we're trying to fight sex trafficking or human trafficking, to start an organization like that requires some pretty big financial gifts, and that's great. But that's an example of a work that you don't get to see a lot of great payoffs and promotional videos about that. It's not right, it's not appropriate, it's not about that, and you don't want to exploit people who've already been exploited. So is the church willing to write checks for things like that, or are they only willing to write checks for the big brand new seminary building in South America?
Yeah, we're coming in on that time of year around Christmas, which is like the materialism capital of I think the United States and the way we think about it. And I think that sometimes our attempt to reconcile the guilt that we feel for being so materialistic is to give our material goods to other people. Like that somehow alleviates our guilt of materialism. But in a lot of ways, all we're doing is transferring our materialism onto somebody else or onto something else. And I think that's really problematic.
Well, and you can see that in American history very clearly with the Native Americans. The Native Americans had a very communal, sharing everything kind of culture. All these different tribes had very strong communal bonds and sharing ethics. And then when the Western, white, usually often Christian settlers came, they started to give one Native American, a gun and not the other one, and tobacco for this one, but not for the other, etc. And they created a real love of materialism, which started to be part of what broke down those great traditions that the Native Americans had.
Well, Patrick, thank you so much for being with us today and having this conversation with us. I'm sure the three of us could probably talk for probably at least another hour or two and dive a little deeper into several parts of this conversation that we had. I did want you to highlight, this isn't even your most recent book that you've written. You've had another book that just came out recently. Yeah. And so with the book that you just recently wrote, how many books have you authored?
I think six, and then one was translated into the German language. So there's 7 books out there, but 6 is the total.
Well, let's definitely plug your most recent book. What's the name of it and what is it about?
Okay, it's actually my spiritual memoir, and it's called No Religion Required. And it's let's see, I can't remember the title. I don't think about my books very much, actually. People would be very surprised how little I think about my books. I have to promote.
I know you don't, because yeah, you have to feed your family, so they need to be promoted. Yeah. And I think you've told me, I mean, pretty much once you turn your manuscript in, you never think about it or read it or
not once.
Process it again until somebody calls you up and asks you to talk about it on a podcast.
Right. Yeah.
So it's your spiritual memoir.
Yeah, and I guess it's called No Religion Required, a memoir of faith, doubt, chocolate milk, and untimely death.
Wow.
And it's a humorous memoir about my spiritual journey. I mean, it's mostly humorous, but it also has some very serious parts. But I'm not writing it to write about myself. I'm actually writing it to write about the idea of religion. Why is it still in our world? Why in this modern technological era do religions still survive and even thrive? Why are so many people around the world still believers in God or the supernatural? And so the book kind of explores the role religion has played through human history and what the benefits have been for humans in embracing religion and what the big downsides have been. So it's a very honest look at the history of religion and why it's of different faiths, not just Christianity. And then within that, broader theme, I tell the story of my own personal journey of kind of wrestling with what does this all mean, and is this a logical, rational, healthy thing to believe in? Because there are some incredible downsides and there's some incredible dark periods. And certainly in my own life, I've had some incredible dark periods affiliated with my religious beliefs. So the book, I think, is really brutally honest. But it also really is not about me. I wrote it for people, for them to think about their own place, not to convert them, but to just think about the role of spirituality and religion in today's world.
And they can buy that on Amazon, correct?
Yeah, any place can carry it, and it's in many countries. I think the easiest is Amazon.com, and also there'll be an audio version coming out for people that prefer the audio version, but you can get the Kindle version or paperback, and there's a hardcover as well that's going to be released as well. So.
And maybe just kind of, again, because I think a lot of people who are listening to this are also going to be intrigued, are curious about the other books or the topics, subjects that you have written about. So maybe just share some of those titles.
All right, I'll make that really quickly so I don't bore anybody. But the first book was called Passport of Faith, An Encounter with World Religions. And that book was actually me traveling around the world, exploring the fundamental beliefs of different religions, going to different countries, and finding out how religion impacts those countries culturally, sociologically, economically. And so I think I traveled to like 14 countries in that book and look at Taoism and Hinduism and Islam and all the major faiths.
And if anybody is in like a Sunday school class that is looking at world religions, it's a great text to utilize for that because it goes so seamlessly through those different religious, not just the religious aspects, but the cultural aspects as well. So I would highly recommend that one if you're looking to do some kind of, small group study on different world religions.
Yeah, well, thanks for that plug. The second one was Faith in the Future, which was just kind of a very smaller overview of what globalization was. And I wrote it at a time when people weren't really using the word globalization much, and they weren't talking about a lot of the issues that we now talk about every single day on the news. So the book was kind of ahead of its time, but now it's not ahead of its time because it was written, I don't know, maybe 15, 16 years ago. The next book was called Mosaic, A Journey Across the Church of God. And I think I traveled to 34 countries in that book. And that was an exploration of the Church of God Anderson, Indiana movement. And really it was about how modernity and globalization wears down denominations and why denominations decline and kind of disintegrate and fall apart. How does that happen? And what are all the pressures that play upon them? But it's a fun book because, once again, like Passport of Faith, I'm traveling around the world. I'm actually meeting people. I'm telling stories. I'm in these exotic locations, and that's what keeps the book from, being a total snoozer. And then the next one was called, I guess the next one was In God We Trust, I guess.
Yes, I think it is.
And then after that was Facing Islam Without Fear. I think that was a Christian, I'm not even remember what the subtitle was, but something about understanding Islam, a Christian's Guide to Understanding Islam, maybe. And that book is very much an overview of Islam, but trying to get Christians to not stereotype Islam, because most Christians have a very simplistic view of the Islamic faith. And it's not a book about defending Islam or being a universalist or whatever that, but it talks about everything from terrorism to Islamic birth rates and just a lot of the stereotypes that people carry that are just not playing out. Like, for instance, we were all led to believe that Europe was going to be taken over by Muslims. And, it has not happened. And in fact, the percentages are really quite low in most countries, and the birth rates are very, very, very low. Birth rates are even declining rapidly in countries that are Islamic. So there was a lot of scaremongering, and that book was there to kind of, help Christians have an educated view of what Islam is. And then the next book is this memoir I just wrote, No Religion Required, which I hope everyone goes and buys right now, because that's like what I got to say.
Patrick, it's been so good to have you. Thanks for joining us. We're so grateful that we get to, swim in the same circles together. We get to engage in ministry together. And thanks so much for using your incredible intellect to help teach us about how our faith is so intertwined with culture. And we'll hopefully connect with you again soon.
Thank you, Patrick.
Well, thank you so much, guys, and we'll see each other again soon.
Thanks for listening to A World of Good. A World of Good is a podcast production of Global Strategy and Church of God Ministries. Our theme song is Colorado by Leo Flores. If you want to join the conversation, visit us at Twitter at A World of Good Pod, on Instagram, A World of Good Podcast, or visit our website, chogglobal.org/A World of Good. And join us next time as we share more stories of good from around the world.